Hello everyone, today we talk about archaic Roman arms and armor, a topic that perfectly lends itself to an incredibly important series of military historical topics regarding that era that on Schwerpunkt I christened feudal Rome, and that is somehow ostic to conceptualize if, of course, for you Rome is fundamentally not just the empire, but this idea of some sort of different world from the more sort of tribal core of continental Europe, and at the same time, admittedly difficult to conceptualize also because indeed there is a proto and eventually proper urbanization. In all of this, that there is an important growth. There are, however, lots of other peoples in the Apennine Peninsula that provide with some interesting term of comparison. Here, we're fundamentally between the 8th and the 4th century BC. This is pre-Camillian Rome. I made some videos about the Battle of the Allia River, about, as I just said, about feudal Rome, about the early enemies of Rome, and a series of other videos about Latium Vetus and the Italics. Recently we talked about the Samnites. So we will actually be making more of this stuff. Technically this video is from the lottery, so it's somehow randomly popping up. But at the same time, it perfectly blends with lots of things we've already seen that we will have to discuss. As you know, probably the most important video on Schwerpunkt is the one about genesis of manipular tactics that I am burningly passionate about. It's one of the topics that I know best, telling you the truth. Even as a medievalist, I know there are certain parts of ancient warfare much better than most sort of medieval military history as such. And I'm therefore thrilled to prepare, probably to pave the way to this important insights. And surely we will make more videos. I made a video about the so-called Serbian army. As you know, there was a mechanistic misconception regarding the idea of the adoption of an hoplitic phalanx system akin to the one of classical Hellas. And while there is the adoption of an hoplitic panoply, and indeed like heavy infantry across the Mediterranean and Europe pretty much looked similar, right? There are important differences as well as overlaps with particular types and armor beyond sort of the obviously not so narrow in confines of Latium, but you can see how, for example, the adoption of the scutum as opposed to the previous, if you think about the ankles of the clippos, there is an idea that the Roman army went by phases. This was this Hellenizing, Orientalizing phase that the Romans get through from the Etruscans, that in turn had obviously taken it from the Eastern Mediterranean. I made a video about the Argos panoply. We also talked about Assyrian warfare technology. So there's a proper tactique, to speak the Hellenic way proper, that consists in the development of battle lines that can orderly pass from column to, in fact, combat formation with greater ease. This goes in parallel with the affirmation of the proper state in case of Hellas. It's obviously the polis, and so what we start to understand also in socio-cultural segmentation as, in fact, the classical Hellenic phalangitic system. So I will not, there is a pretty hefty video I already made on how hoplitic tactics were never actually adopted in the way we intended as far as the Greeks were concerned, nor by the Etruscans, nor by the Romans, and nor by any other people, telling the truth. And this is what people tend not to instead of being obsessed with the debunking of the hoplite heresy, that, you know, once a theory is wrong, like, completely remove it. Like, if you want to make some niche historiographical consideration, do it. But in this case, especially, like, the hoplitic heresy was something that in the rest of the world, aside from specific academies and sort of their inflated resonance, never really took a real root across also the amateur. Like, if you read Herodotus, to say that, and you start reconstructing battles and campaigns, you don't even think about this stuff because it's all much better explained by proper sources. There's this paralyzing skepticism that the quote-unquote experts have to provide you to warn you that, of course, it takes a lot of sort of prior expertise to talk about certain topics. You must be able to read the original language in order at least to have some very good and reliable translation that takes in consideration the semantics, the sort of the depth of prelinear sort of language. But everything is actually simpler, as von Clausewitz tells us about war. War is hard, but it's actually simple, and sort of overcomplicating it also in terms of the history of the art of war is somehow really perverted at a point. Today, we also just basically introduce archaic Roman arms and armor that obviously overlap with a great part of what we see among the Italic and Italian peoples. The objective is just to tell you more or less how things worked, panologically speaking. The development of heavy, so to say, weapons and armor in this, what will become this more robust linear warfare, emphasizing cohesion as opposed to the various clanic groups that took place in a battle line, but still in less, in fact, especially at the level of collective training, robust level among the Hellenes, began as early as the 8th century BC. This was shaped by strong influences from Eastern civilizations, above all the Assyrians that had the best army of the time, and was heavy infantry. In fact, I have, by random extraction, military historical unit series about Assyrian infantry coming up soon, with sort of increasingly, again, robust or better supplied heavy infantries. At this point, cavalry is actually fully developing as an arm, with chariots gradually declining. But this also happens with the affirmation of infantry as the predominant arm on the battlefield. So this is reflected by also the level of quality in panoply. You see bronze helmets, scale armor, coordinated formations. All this were observed by Hellenic mercenaries serving in the Levant during campaigns and service under Assyrian kings. This is yet another underestimated and very fascinating, as a matter of fact, military historical topic. This is at the same time for the same Italics, right? There is this paradoxically later Roman narrative that wants the Romans, the Italics, to spring out in the Mediterranean, out of the blues almost, right? But I made a video about the participation of the early Italics to the sea people's raids in the Levant, in Egypt, and so on. And this is a thing that keeps going on and on. Like if you look at the early pacts between Rome and Carthage, there are all some very powerful indicators that doesn't matter how Carthage was sort of a city and sort of unitarily controlling its navy, but apparently Italic war bands were settling all over North Africa because of this demographic exuberance of the Apennine Peninsula. And there was no realistic way to curb them, if not by sort of trying to deflect the raids. And given that Rome was rising to hegemony in Italy, that's why the deals with Carthage are sort of half deals. At the end of the day, initially they allied each other against Alexander, like as a preemptive coalition. But as you know, the Magus would not live long to turn his attention to the West, which was propedeutic in part also to his renewed campaigns in India. Just for telling you how actually wide but also small the world really was. I made also a video about the so-called Dorian migrations that did actually exist in spite of the best efforts of certain historiography in the 1960s and 1970s to sort of relativize and sort of deconstruct everything. And that overlap, as we've seen in the Balkan and the Apennine Peninsulas, not just with the affirmation of the more recognizable sort of ethnic players that we'll see in the following centuries, like in this case, the Italic peoples with all the various tribes that we know from later history start being recognizable after this last and bigger migration. These were increasingly larger migrations compared to the prior sort of much more sort of filtering, still pervasive, but sort of warband by warband to stereotype the scale at the beginning in the same places. And this goes in parallel with the advancement of the metalworking techniques that had emerged in Central Europe, particularly in regions associated with the urn field that is roughly 1300 to the mid 8th century, and Hallstatt cultures that supplied superior bronze and early iron forging methods, including advanced sheet bronze armor, helmets, and weapons distributed through trade and cultural exchanges across the Alps and Adriatic routes. Right. So this is a pretty intense tide that coincides, in fact, with the establishment of the more distinctly recognizable Latin culture. It's more like solar, virile elements, etc. It would be interesting to talk about the previous period as well, and we'll surely cover this at some point for our Bronze Age Warfare series. Today we talk about, however, this later, fundamentally Iron Age, even though, as you perfectly know, iron and bronze coexisted for a very long time as well. And these Central European cultures, flourishing in areas of modern Austria, southern Germany, and northern Italy, pioneered sophisticated bronze sheet working for cuirasses and helmets that Hellenic artisans adapted, while Assyrian military campaigns in the Levant exposed Hellenic soldiers of fortune to this discipline-heavy infantry formations, emphasizing large shields and thrusting spears in tight order. All right, so very interesting and powerful set of factors that sort of plastically illustrate how and why certain specific type of warfare will start emerging from Southern Europe. Now, this, because as you know, the Assyrians eventually do not develop the same level of heaviness of the Hellenes. If you look at the Persian wars, the Achaemenid army at large was sort of softer, right, on average. It just was a matter of social background, like in all different cultural reasons, right, that are mostly political. It depends also on the peoples that you encounter. This adoption transformed not only combat techniques, but also the fundamental conception of war and the warrior himself. The early American heroic model of fighters engaging the enemy in series of at least allegedly individual duels gradually gave way to the citizen warrior, who stood in a dense, tightly coordinated formation and entrusted both his personal honor and his future to the cohesion of the phalanx. Right, and so a polis that emerges as a broader body. In fact, this is the step forward in Roman history is actually the 4th century BC. That's the moment in which the patricians decide to unlock the plebeian resources by entrusting them with certain imperium-provided magistracies, right? And so that's the affirmation of the, we can't call it Camillian, Livian, but it's fundamentally what we know as the Manipular army that will reach its maturity during the Punic Wars and be called Polybian also for that reason, as Polybius is this incredibly precious source for the description of its tactics. And this shows you, naturally, as you very well know, Hellas and Roma were very different cultures in some ways. In others, however, and I've always said this whenever we talk about ancient warfare, it's actually the type of warfare that we see here across Europe is pretty similar. Like, sedimentarily speaking, a Celtic host, up to, especially this time compared to an Italic, but it was practically the same, also because they were practically almost the same people, as we've seen also in some videos about the comparison of Italic and Celtic, and so on. But and I don't want to digress now in Hellenic warfare, but as you understand, it's quite connected. When we talk about the phalanx, it's difficult to define this, if not by degrees and comparison with other peoples, because you could simply say this is, as most armies had been, like a rectangular mass formation of heavily armored spearmen advancing in unison. The overlapping shield thing is indeed something debatable. Essentially, indeed, the idea of hoplitic heresies is founded to the extent that an hoplitic revolution, quote-unquote, never really existed, right? This change was deep, right? It was not merely technical, profoundly social one. It was also very very long term in its development, right? Essentially, what we intend as classical Hellenic classical phalanx essentially is what we see during the Peloponnesian War, right? In its maturity, it's just like, I don't know what we just said regarding the Roman manipular legion, right? That from the time of Livy and the Second Punic War, even just across the century, was something importantly different. When I say Livy, as you know, that it's called the Libyan legion, as much as it's well described for the end of the 4th century BC, obviously by Livy that lived much later. Now, what is the big change? Well, it's deep at so many anthropological levels. Essentially, the warrior no longer fought for isolated personal glory, right? Line of principle. The Mycenaean world was much more sort of aristocratically based. As you know, there were kings proper. Chariot warfare itself illustrated this very much more sort of hierarchical system. At this point, it's injection of forces from other parts of Europe. Had it been just as a model, as a strengthening, as a moral toughening, right? It's not necessarily just a demographic thing, but it also is, telling the truth, creates this more compact infantry formations that, as sort of during the Sea People's invasions, the Levant had to find out the hard way, being capable of successfully withstanding war chariot charges, right? And therefore crippling much of sort of the tactical fundamentals on which this world had relied on for a millennium, essentially. As you understand, this force comes from Europe. It's one of the many great waves of continental European power that routinely hegemonize the surroundings and affirm themselves as the dominant military culture, right? So the little note, the so-called heroic warfare, like sung by Homer, by many other obvious sort of cultural references of the past. As you know, we start also in traditional spirituality to go back in time. That is the age of heroes, right? Had been an age of gods, right? But we understand that, at least as far as we can document, that such thing like warfare based on isolated duels never really ever existed, right? There was a loser kind of engagement that is reflective of this hierarchical system we observed before, where infantry was actually subordinated to the mounted element that was naturally more elitary, was less numerous. And so there you have the idea in perspective of the centrality of the war. When you look at early Hellenic, sort of this essentially gestating Hellenic phalanx, you still see, look at the archaic Tyrtaios, for example, lots of mentions of, first of all, not just the Hellenic hoplite already in this classical and classicizing dimension, being understood as a hero of some sort. If you look at the early hoplitic panoply, it's still pretty heavy, right? In its archaic form, it's very reminiscent of the previous era, in which you have even the more crushing and traumatic dendra like panoplies and so on, gradually sort of homogenizing, but still with lots of retinue, so to say. At least you have archers, lighter element. The cavalry was also more important than we think. Countering the so-called hoplitic heresy, aside from the timeline and other things, shouldn't go, however, and ever too far from the other side in claiming that classical Hellenic warfare fundamentally wasn't a contest between, actually for the time being, and other people's military styles, a thickly packed heavy infantry formation, right? Most of the heresy stems from the notion that these people, say the authors of the same, sort of fabricated this notion, but they were literally measuring the centimeters of how stuck sort of next to one another these soldiers were, and would never like fight in any other way, right? So that is as dumb as it gets. It's obvious that there would be some individual feats, that phalanx was something more malleable than we think. And we should, in fact, even exceed from the other side. Like there's still, as we'll partially see today, even lots of people who think, if we talk about it in the video about the Samnites and their warfare as well, in others, that, I don't know, the Samnites fought in open order, and so the Romans had to create something, quote-unquote, more flexible compared to an allegedly previous hoplitic system. This is a massive pile of... First of all, if you know the basics of Roman Samnitic warfare, you know that the major battles were all in a flat plain, so they would have actually favored a phalanx, and you know perfectly well that there was heavy infantry there, that by definition is not a hit and run skirmishing one. So actually, and of course, Italy had, as well as practically the whole rest of Europe, thickly packed heavy infantry formations, just like the Hellenes, that had indeed a very peculiar type of warfare on their own. Is the more distinctive, or at least perhaps we even exceeded in making it more distinctive compared to those other peoples that were importantly different political social fundamentals, called as phalanx, which was essentially a tree log, was a stream rolling. Like that's the vision they had of saying pretty much any other heavy infantry formation they ever met. Right, if you're talking about the Persians, the Carthaginians, the Celts, the Romans, the term is standard. So there's nothing really strict or technical or categorical. If you just have a basic idea without sort of mental elucubrations, so to say, about ancient warfare, you know that even these sort of peaky definitional issues are just for people that notoriously do not know much concretely about the same. Now, we have indeed in Hellas, as you know, the compaction of these local city-states, like the rise of the polis, independent powers like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Argos, where land-owning farmers gained political rights quite gradually, by the way. We've seen, and I made a video, by the way, about the Indo-European etymology of the Roman so-called republican civic / even institutional voting system. And if you understand what those things actually mean, you realize this was all based on an assembly of warriors in tribal times. Right? Only gradually, in fact, the Romans maintained the tribes literally as notorious as part of their voting districts. This is actually the very same for the Hellenes. So again, this is not much like a modern secular state. It is pretty much like just the stepping up in civilizational development of otherwise it was a pretty traditional system. And the same idea of, again, this quote-unquote rights, or better, just political participation based on their power, and the same military service, fostering, and this is the other properly wrong term, democratic elements, because this was not a democratic society, but not in the sense of what we intend democratic even today. It was not democratic in the sense that they didn't even think it was democratic, right? They understood with them as something completely different, and this was a highly stratified society still, in a way, and always the most powerful maintained control, after all. This is much more pronounced in Rome, admittedly, but the same was true in Hellas. And you have, importantly, however, and this is deeply important also as far as Western identity, the linkage of, in this case, hoplite service to citizenship and land ownership, right? And that's really a big deal in historical hindsight. And of course, for how the change was quite gradually occurring at that time. Now, the consequent passage from heroic single combat, again, quote-unquote single combat, to disciplined battle reflected the rise of the polis, tactica meaning order in Hellenic, by the way, so this is quite relevant, and the growing importance of the citizen as the essential unit of collective defense. So these new ideas about warfare later spread throughout the Hellenic world. In Italy, they first took root in the city-states of Magna Graecia, to say it the Latin way, and so these were still essentially Hellenes, the network of Hellenic colonies founded from the late 8th century BC onward in southern Italy and Sicily. Look at the timeline here. Because you say, if you study this from history books, it's just at some point in the 8th century BC that the Hellenes start colonizing the Mediterranean. And wait a minute, what had happened just up to the day before? The Sea Peoples. So you realize that this was not really just, that we've been told, no, because democracy was born and then they started for some reason, also colonizing. It's just the moment in which the classical Greece begins. These were normal expansions, essentially, from these core peoples from Europe that had settled in the south, were swarming all across, right? And from centuries, right? We've seen also some historical military naval unit regarding the development of naval warfare. It's all very continuous. There's not much of a fracture at the end of the day. We have in Italy, very famously, and I made, again, an entire video also describing all these coastline sites as far as what the Hellenes thought regarding the Italic, in the sense also pre-Roman. Rome already existed, or at least sort of what was to become properly the polity was already there in terms of power, and they had participated themselves into this sort of naval business, with all, in fact, the locations, right, and how dangerous they were, because they were populated by sort of, as you know, also from the Odyssey, monsters, where this is actually a metaphor to speak of the quite aggressive Italic coastal populations that tended to sort of to heavily engage in piracy and sort of raiding, and so harassing the Hellenic activity as well. And there was a lot of warfare, especially in southern Italy, between these polis and the peoples like the Lucani or the Bruti. Cumae, for example, is sort of notorious. It had been founded around 740 BC by the Oiboians from the island of Oiboia in central Hellas, a key early transmitter of Hellenic culture. And so also think about panoplies. At this point, the Hellenic ones were the more advanced in Mediterranean, right? Other peoples acquired them too, the Celts, the Scythians, right? The alphabet was here also introduced partly via adaptations of Phoenician script, and Urban's institutions, in part, like are expanding in Italy in this proto-urban or de facto urbanizing context. You have Sybaris, an Achaean foundation renowned for its wealth and luxury before its destruction in 510 BC. Croton, another Achaean colony famous for its athletes like the wrestler Milo. And as a center of Pythagorean philosophy, Tarentum, Taras, actually in Hellenic, a Spartan colony established around 706 that became a major naval and commercial power. Metapontum, founded by the Achaeans, again near the Bradano River, an agricultural hub with important sanctuaries. So these colonies brought not only trade and agriculture, but also military practices, art, and so paradoxically also the means for this arms and armor to be depicted by the locals, for us to know what that was about, aside from burials. And that iconographic element is quite tied with the archaeological one, as well as urban planning that profoundly shaped local Italic and Etruscan societies through sustained cultural and commercial interactions, including the export of olive oil, wine, pottery, and architectural models like the Hellenic temple form with peristyle columns. Right, so we're talking about urbanization. It's more like the political order per se. It was also never quite the same one of Hellas. Say the urban element was essentially a Levantine origin model that surely had been influencing the Mediterranean, also its northern shores, with these strongholds, fortified hilltops, gradually evolving to something more imitative. Also because these were tendentially richer places. The richest had been the Levant at that point, but southern Europe obviously was also gaining ground, especially considering all the expansion, the plan, the maritime activity that had been going on for quite a while. That means also a shift in trade balance. So it's quite relevant in the history of Western civilization. The Etruscans, as you know, a sophisticated civilization centered in central Italy, but not only, like pretty much from the north to the south, but concentrated in mostly modern Tuscany, parts of Umbria and Lazio, especially the so-called Dodecapolis. that in fact suggest these important centers that sort of weren't born from a day to another. Like the Etruscans, we think, were actually Indo-Europeans, possibly Hittites, they possibly from Anatolia, it's all possibly, and they weren't much of a people per se. They essentially grafted themselves on the pre-existing culture, the Villanovan one of Italy, and they had come to rule as, again, lords. If you understand this already from the previous centuries, this sort of petty kings and chieftains that moved with their war chariots and seized places through their raids across the Mediterranean. So it's all pretty much in line with the general picture. You have urban centers like Tarquinia, known for its painted tombs depicting banquets and daily life. We described a bit what was the Etruscan mentality and spirituality. It's quite fascinating. You have Veii. This was a major rival to early Rome because it was the southernmost of the Etruscan cities with advanced hydraulic engineering. The Romans owed much to this very advanced civilization, technologically speaking, urbanistically. Betulonia is a prosperous mining and metallurgical center on the Tyrrhenian coast. Right, the most important extraction ground was Elba Island, the same one where Napoleon would be exiled some time later, flourishing from the 8th to the 7th centuries BC and developing a distinct culture blending local Villanovan roots, in fact characterized by cremation urns and early iron use, with Orientalizing and Hellenic influences through the extensive trade networks reaching the Eastern Mediterranean, and showing a lively interest, in fact, in this quote-unquote Oriental elements that is mostly sort of Hellenic, including weapons. And so that's why we're talking about this. Context is important. So we will get to the meaty panoplogical aspects in a while, but without this, it would be time wasted, I think. And so what does it happen? That the Etruscans adopted elements of the hoplite panoply, such as the clipos/aspis, the large round shield central to the name, in fact, hoplite from Hellenic hoplon, that is actually, in fact, considered as a greater defense and protection. It's not merely just the shield, but there is actually eventually like an homonymy made for the shield as well. In certain contexts, right, the notion that hoplon was never used as a term for the shield is actually wrong in the length. It's being being pointed out that hoplon is meant to be like the broader, in fact, what we call the panoply as such, so the armor system. But it's obvious that the shield played a very important role, and also in Hellenic language, differently from Latin, military units are actually called with the name on the basis of their shields names, right? Whereas the Romans had called their units on the basis of their weapons, right? Naturally, also, especially in the Hellenistic era, this changes a bit in the East, but this is not so important now. Just for telling you how there was an important difference in mindset. That definitely Hellas was more modern, secular than Italy was at this point. Now, this starts happening very gradually in Etruria from the late 7th century, but more as a matter of fashion among the wealthy than for the adoption of true hoplite tactics. In fact, they also never actually happened. These were actually never adopted for the simple reason that Etruria did not have the same type of social organization of Hellas. Right, the Etruscans were a large, quote-unquote, feudal society where there was a hyper-elite that controlled practically everything, and most of the other people were kind of peasants, serfs. And so they actually had very good elite heavy infantry of some sort that would adopt hoplitic arms and armor, but not for fighting into it. In fact, they also possess protopila, they fought with axes. We know very well that you can absolutely fight in a more looser and individual fashion with hoplitic arms and armor, because at the end of the day, they will work for killing people and defending yourself at the same time, also if they're not specifically designed for this or that. In fact, we should get rid of this crystallized idea that weapon, it was useful only in that context. No. right? And this is, I would say, very well exemplified by the Roman army that was, I will use this very often over and misused term of being quite, quote unquote, flexible. And people are sometimes schizophrenic, and they don't understand that the Romans were both disciplined and individualistically minded in many ways. They were obviously and preferably before, from the origins as Italic warriors into proper Roman legionaries with an incredibly brutal discipline. But still, the pinch of warrior ethos and aggressiveness and individual mindset was absolutely exalted by the Romans and channeled in the right ways. And there are so many indicators. We've seen them in all kind of battles and ages in Roman culture. And so even there, nobody actually knows how the Romans really fought. Like if you want to say, at this time, the Romans actually fought with more compact ranks. And this is because this weapon this is done normally without any kind of, first of all, proof of this, of evidence or of figure. And in especially very often decontextualizing even heavy, legionary heavy infantry from other types of troops. I just recently talked about this in a video about the broader Roman art of war, though starting in that case from the 2nd century BC onward up to sort of the 6th century AD, right? Just for the sake of massive introductions. And we have iconographic evidence of this is all fairly well documented. This includes the stele of Aule Felusque or Abele Felusque from Vetulonia, in fact, we're of course in Etruria, late 7th century BC, depicting a warrior with a plumed Corinthian-style helmet. This is also really typical. The same Roman legionnaires would, because of style, like still have lots of Hellenic, either purchased or supplied at some point when they start expanding in the Mediterranean. The allies provide them with this local produced panoplies, large round shield, and double-headed axe in particular, which definitely does not align with the, again, stereotypically, at least thickly packed, sort of ever-close formations of the classical Hellenic phalanx as a symbol of power, right? In particular, the axe and especially the battle axe culture there is pouring like crazy together with lots of solar symbols, again, after this last waves of Indo-European conquest. Certain swastikas, they appear everywhere, right? And so you understand what was going on there. And this is, in particular, one of the earliest Etruscan funerary monuments with an inscription identifying the deceased as son of Tusnute and the donor, highlighting elite adoption of mixed Hellenic and local elements in a sandstone slab about 1 meter high placed in the Costiaccia Bagini necropolis. And the stele, carved in local sandstone and showing the warrior advancing with mixed armament, exemplifies how Etruscan elites selectively incorporated Hellenic helmet and shield forms while retaining distinctive status symbols like the axe, reflecting broader so-called orientalizing artistic trends that fuse Levantine motifs with local Italic traditions around 700-600 BC. So the Romans that were already there, and of course, Rome had been already there, even if it wasn't necessarily sort of organized politically. The site had been inhabited since prehistory, from a very long time prior. Now, the Romans absorbed military tactics and technologies primarily through the Etruscans, or at least they developed with this sort of dominating culture at a point that obviously served also as the model. It's not like the Romans absorbed, like this was spreading pretty much across the Mediterranean. The Etruscans were the greater vessel, but all these other peoples were sort of changing already by themselves. They didn't need to wait for a merchant to bring them that type of weapon. Actually, we have seen how, we found even Italic colonists in the Ptolemaic army later in Egypt together with, Thracians and whatever. So these guys were actually much more out there than we think already, way before the Roman expansion outside. And considered the Etruscans, or some elements of the Etruscan nobility, dominated early Rome during the regal, in fact, sort of the later part of the regal period with kings like the Tarquins from the late 7th to the 6th centuries BC, a dynasty traditionally linked to Tarquinius Priscus and Superbus will introduce urban infrastructure like the Cloaca Maxima drainage system, attributedly, and to a lesser extent through commercial relations with the Hellenic cities of Campania and southern Italy as well, that in any case were controlled in the coastline by the Etruscans, especially as they bit the hell out of the Carthaginians at sea, because the Etruscans had also a hell of a navy, and it seems that the rostrum was actually an Etruscan invention, and or at least it is. Its first finding is associated with it, together with many other things. Chain mail armor, for example, for the first time appears not in the sort of those Romanian finds in the Carpathians, but actually among the Etruscans. It is just for saying that they were pioneering much of military technology at the time, but indeed military technology is a bit more widespread on its own, really, and there isn't really like a guy or a people that in general invents or discovers this and the others didn't know. I had to wait for for them to tell them. But those who are pioneering that are surely the power that sort of makes school in that regard. So this process of military acculturation was never passive either. As we have already understood, the Romans actively adapted, selected, and integrated elements from different traditions, creating a hybrid and flexible system that proved highly effective in the Italic context by combining the robustness of Apennine weapons with Etruscan refinement and Hellenic discipline, yet without ever fully assuming hoplite combat modes. Right? Nobody did outside of Hellas, right? If you look even at the same Hellenic colonies of southern Italy, they technically, yes, they had phalanxes, but they fought in sort of very different ways. That model was soon not abandoned, but complemented with many other elements. At some point, it's Syracuse that, for example, is the strongest Hellenic city in the entire Hellenic world, really. And if you look at its army, it's sort of very different from the one of Sparta and Athens that basically dictate a bit the idea that we have of classical Hellenic phalanxes. And we'll talk more about that. I have some videos about Puno-Hellenic warfare. If you're interested, we will surely make more about that. Now, unlike the Hellenic hoplite model, the Romans elaborated their own tribal tradition into more organized forms, developing what will become, as we call it, manipular tactics. This was a quote-unquote flexible system of small units. The manipuli, typically 121, I mean, sort of they change over time, and every army was different, arranged in 3 lines. The Astati, Principes, and Triari in sort of stereotypically, and this is also unproven, notoriously enough, the checkerboard quincunx formation that allowed allegedly sort of maneuverability in rough terrain per se, but we don't really have a sort of specific proof of this being universal or standard or specifically distinguishing the Romans from other peoples in particular. Right? If we look at the Greeks, we don't have obviously mentions of this kind, but we shouldn't think that Roman armies, this is the bottom line, were that different from any other. Again, heavy infantry was gradually becoming ever more collectively trained and cohesive from a disciplinary point of view. In particular, while remaining fundamentally individualistic fighters in a more disciplined framework, yes, but still the process that was probably painstakingly long and intense, again, sort of properly being able to impose this level of discipline and collective training is the major feat that the Roman ever pulled off in terms of military organization, right, during the 4th century BC. We will have ample opportunity to talk about manipular tactics, as I said at the beginning. The early manipular legion wasn't at all something, as we said before, like gapped in ways that we can't even reconstruct, by the way, permitting simply independent maneuver and reinforcement. We don't even actually know whether they even swapped these units, whatever. We actually have throughout most of military history the showing of sort of in-depth armies being about multiple battle lines that sort of succeeded one another such. We don't have this micro tactical management history. And it's all basically a conjecture based on, in fact, no evidence whatsoever for anyone who knows sort of the basics, the fundamentals of the entirety of military sort of Roman warfare sources availability. This also the notion that gets often put on the fore that sort of Roman manipular tactics would fundamentally emerge just as a consequence of the Samnite Wars between the 343 and 290 BC, because they had to cope with the agile mountain warriors of the central Apennines, where the rigid phalanx proved vulnerable in hilly terrain, is actually a misconception, right? As much as it is that the alleged theory that the Romans incorporated tactical flexibility observed from Samnite loose order skirmishing with javelins while maintaining their own emphasis on disciplined close combat. I mean, this type of warfare was pretty universal among Italics. It's not like the Latins or the Samnites had historically fought in particularly different ways. Rome was more influenced by Etruscans and this hoplite system that was more sustainable for an emerging city-state in a very powerful fertile Latium, and so they would gradually look something relatively different from the Samnites. But the notion, first of all, that it's the ground that makes you change tactics per se, it's something that completely obliterates the political reason why the Romans passed from a unitary sort of feudal phalanx, like the one that was crushed by the Gauls, exactly because it was just one battle line, and when outflanked would collapse at the Battle of the Allia River. That in and of itself is a valid reason for saying, okay, we need more in-depth battle lines, which is also not a matter of sort of they woke up after the Allia. It's also based on how much manpower is available, how much you can field it. So this depended on the Roman internal, again, patrician plebeian dynamics, the sort of manpower availability also through allies. Look at the Latin League. At some point, the Romans fight alongside with the Samnites against the Latins, as you probably know. We've also seen it at the famous Battle of Suessa. It is replete with sort of individual combat, knightly, equestrian sort of ethos and tactics all over the place. So the point here is that the reason why the Romans sort of change, because this is the gradual sort of procession, so to say, of the from the hoplitic system, hoplitic, quote unquote, hoplitically styled sort of system to the manipular one, is merely organizational. It didn't have to do much with tactics themselves. Also because the big question is that even though we see hoplites fighting in obviously through archaeological finds of hoplitic armament, and also some iconographic representation that sometimes, like the Kiji Olp, has been said, oh, look, this is actually a phalanx. So they were just like the Greeks. No, right? There are all sort of reasons for knowing that that is not a depiction of an actual phalangitic. There's no reason to think about, of that to begin with. Like a aligned amount of troops, like side to side, is not, doesn't mean anything per se. And we don't have like a video footage of what a Roman army looked like, but we do know that through the eventual equipment that we see, like the typical scutum, pilum, right, the gradual adoption, in fact, of also more actually heavier rank and file troops, because the Romans also had in their feudal times, as the term itself suggests, this patrician oligarchy that monopolized warfare as a sort of mobster clans that were successfully keeping sort of the pleb under, but the pleb was also being influenced by the Etruscan monarchs, and they had sort of third estaters, craftsmen, etc. And initially, Roman warfare is truly mostly just about this, like as we said before in the previous period, this more aristocratic force, and some retinue men had always been there from the lower estates, but not the rank and file homogeneous formation, as it will especially become in the 2nd century BC, or already at the end of the 3rd, telling you the truth. You don't have to wait Marius for having de facto the prototype of the princeps being becoming de facto homogeneous across the heavy infantry. But in fact, the same manipular, the classical manipular legion is segmented not just in battle lines, but in the heaviness of the same. And there were also swaps at the beginning, like even the same name, as you know, of the Astati, etc. It changed, sort of speaking of other type of, the asta is the spear, right? And we know that eventually the later Polybian Astatus is not a spearman, at least in the way it's described to us. It's actually a more complicated issue than it sounds, and one has to be careful about the definition, the weapons names. There is a lot of philology of the Roman sagas, mainly Livy. There are lots of interesting hints scattered all across, so I don't want to spoiler too much, but we'll get pretty thoroughly in all of this. But when you look at it from the bigger picture, you also realize that this loser kind of fighting, which means loser not in like in a video game where you have people compacted or sort of in close order and open order, means loser in the sense that the various clans had not received, were not powerful enough to enforce discipline, cohesive discipline on large swathes of the population. And so they lined up as they would normally do in a battle line, but thinking independently or autonomously from one another to an important degree. This is just like the Celts or the Germans would behave, right? Now everything becomes more courageous. You don't have, again, to wait for all the clans arriving at different times, not having experience with one another. With the manipular system, everything gets sort of statically controlled. You have a better discipline, better supplies. You pass from column formation to battle line more quickly. So this is what makes eventually a military civilization. And this was also relatively universal, as we explained, right? And as I said before, when you look at the major battle with the Samnites, they were on the flat ground, right? They were the Romans obviously sort of spilled an incredibly large amount of blood conquering the Apennine hinterland, right? But this was also not really the typical or standard conventional warfare that simply forged the manipular legion with its own characteristics. On the contrary, looking at their armament, there was also lighter, as we've seen also in the, or at least properly suited to some, because also the hoplites had a segmentation within the ranks. So we look at the better panoplies and we say, okay, that's very heavy, right? But they themselves had, just like the italics, some social stratification. And in this sense, like when you look at even how the scutum took over and so on, you realize that those models had already existed before. You find them also in some specific iconography. They are mixed with the oplon, so to say, or the hoplitic shield, if you prefer. And so we don't even think that they simply adopted a hoplitic style of warfare or especially equipment, and they simply passed later to something that they actually already had and were developing, but only now was, for some reason, taking over. It's also, this doesn't quite hold water per se. There is also a lot of pride considered this, and this is shown across other peoples and even more primitive ones. Namely, the fact that the elite was the more internationalized, as always, and tended to use and to show off like their wealth with this expensive foreign purchase or loot element. There was a lot of recycling. We find at times, I don't know, the Illyrians fighting at some point with helmets that were, I don't know, hundreds of years anachronistic or sort of from another year, because they tended to treasure these weapons because they cost too much in their own world. And so that's what they ended up getting at the end of the day from the outside, right? So again, we don't have a video footage of what an Etruscan or a Roman army actually felt like, but we can understand this better in a much more smoothly flowing, continuous way through their battle accounts. Today, unfortunately, we just talked about arms and armor, which is also like an interesting topic, obviously enough, but we'll have more fun with that in other videos. But it's important to make this premise, because without that, you may be confused about how sort of much more natural and less complicated, at least the actual transformation of the Roman army really was, after all, and logical, right? There is no need to overcomplicate history, really. So let's skip the notion that the Samnites were doing this for goodness sake. They were fighting also against other opponents, by the way, the Celts, right? Actually, not much the Greeks. Lots of people think, for some strange reason, and this is probably even much worse than all the other weird hypotheses that we sort of hinted at today, that sort of the Romans had surpassed this phalangitic system so that they were effective against the phalanx, that they weren't fighting, all these centuries. And that the later Roman victories of the Manipular legion against the Macedons, or the Alexander's war school, would have been due to this. And instead, they have nothing to do with that. Like, they have to do with battle lines, with command, morale, luck. They have basically nothing to do with military technology, as it is actually the case throughout most warfare. You can even have those means, but if you don't have the means, the resources properly to have them, or the capacity to putting them together, if you don't have an effective command, you don't win, right? Technology is the eternal illusion, right? Normally, of course, those who can pioneer these technologies are also the best employers of the same. So it is important, but it's more like a consequence than a cause, right? Tactics make weapons, not the other way around, or if they do, in a completely minority way, right? And so when you look at Romano-Etruscan equipment and style, you see how it was specifically better suited for single combat and dueling, or at least something that was so less cohesive than hoplitic tactics, in contrast to, in fact, what you see there, the hoplite panoply, the same hoplite panoply being used, again, proving that this arms and armor were suitable to different kind of combat, right? But still, for this reason, in Italy, there was some lighter or more single combat kind of functional weaponry next to it as well. So Roman history is notoriously rich in celebrated episodes of single combat. This have a metaphysical meaning in the sagas. You have Romulus defeating Acro or Acron, king of the Caeninenses. Caenina was a small Latin settlement near Rome, after the rape of the Sabine women and dedicating the first spolia opima, so the richest spoils taken from an enemy commander slain in single combat, which was originally also actually a human sacrifice, in fact, offered to Jupiter Feretrius, in fact, in a special temple on the Capitoline Hill, marking the highest military honor reserved for commanders who personally killed opposing leaders, right? It was much more gruesome than you normally told in history books when you talk about Roman history. Now, the Horati, the Roman triplet brothers overcoming the Curiati, the Alban triplets, Alba Longa, if you know the etymology, that exudes in the Indo-Europeanness from all sides. This was the great sanctuary city that had dominated the Latins, and the Romans in this instance actually beat those heroes. Like, this is in a legendary duel deciding, in fact, the fate of the same Alba Longa under King Tullus Hostilius in the early regal period. You have Aulus Cornelius Cossus slaying Lars Tolumnes, king of Veii, in 437 or 426 BC during wars with Etruscan cities and Fidenae, becoming only the second to win Spolia Opima. Fidenae is also the city that carries out the massacre, the slaughter of the gens Fabia, that in this feudal context, so to practically control that section of the Roman district with their own private forces, and their stronghold was surrounded, and that they fought to the last, were cut to pieces by the Fidainates. You have Horatius Cocles, the one-eyed, defending the Pons Sublicius, the Sublician bridge over the Tiber, against Lars Porsenna's Etruscan army around 508 BC. This is naturally mostly the realm of myth plus history. We don't know much about sort of fully certain, like in a conventional historical sense, until the beginning of the 3rd century BC. But this is all sort of, we understand the legacy of a radically dense military history that the Romans were going through, and that is completely coherent with what was happening, especially in relation with the Etruscans. And there you have this heroic sacrifice allowing Romans to destroy the bridge and save the city during this early Republican defense against Etruscan restoration attempts. Famously, Titus Manlius Torquatus defeating a gigantic goal beyond the Nomentan bridge in 361 BC, earning the cognomen Torquatus after stripping the Torque neck ring from his fallen enemy. A sort of David versus Goliath thing, except the difference between the Europeans and Semites is that while David kills Goliath it may have been one of these very Europeans, as you know, like the Philistines. Look at the sea peoples, right? With a sling, the Roman David, in this case, probably attacks into his close hand-to-hand combat, stabbing like the goal, like at close range the enemy, that bloodily, and telling you what sort of this local warfare was really about. And so these episodes, preserved in a Roman annalistic tradition, underscored the cultural value placed on personal virtus, so the manly excellence, and warriorhood proper, even within collective structures, with Spolia Opima representing the pinnacle of achievement dedicated in the ancient temple of Jupiter Feretrus. It was the site to Rome's foundational myths and visited by later generals like Marcellus in 222 BC. This enduring emphasis on individual valor within a disciplined collective distinguishes the Roman approach. As a result, war itself was shifting away from clashes between individuals towards confrontations usually kept as short and decisive as possible, and therefore far more violent. And that's something that you see even among the Celto-Germanics, for example, as far as the initial charge was concerned, because the system was more primitive. They didn't have time and resources to sustain their forces both morally and materially on the field for a long time, so they invested everything in the first charge. That's how you see how the Romans were in that same way, but the creation of a system like the Manipular Legion with 3 battle lines shows a stepping up in the art of war and in fact the capacity to sustain longer battles with these reserves that you can gradually inject into the fray. And with great, again, ingenuity and strategical purpose and logic, the other Italics actually fought pretty much in the same way. We've seen how the Romans fought, well, against the Latins, for example, in the Battle of Suessa. They were the same people in many ways, but also the Oscans were fundamentally in open field capable of fighting in the same identical way. So it's not just about Rome, right? Don't make it all about Rome. There is an Italic national background that is where Rome emerges from, right? And exceptionalism, revolutions, and all this pile of garbage do not belong to the history of the art of war, right? It's something all much more gradual, and that you have, that in this sense, you have to understand highlights moral differences rather than material ones. Because this is what war is, like a clash between moral forces, primarily, right? And the Romans notoriously, as we've seen in their sagas, highlighted the concept, but this is part, as we've seen, of the entire universal tradition, right? The hero is tendentially, you can look at, seen it among the Jews with David, or the Giles with Cuchulainn, or again the Aesir, when they crush the Olympians, when they crush the Titans, the monsters, they're actually smaller than them, right? And so there is an important meaning behind it. It's naturally it's a metaphysical concept. These peoples praised physical strength, etc., but when it was the mirror of a corresponding moral superiority. In fact, if you don't have that, you can't be even that big, but failing, right? And that is a sin, because you had the potential, but you misused that, right? And you have in feudal Rome this entire communities or groups of men bound not only by family ties, but increasingly by shared military bonds. And so something that was gradually building up the same Roman political and municipal identity as well. It all starts from the war bands, right? This is true for the ancient states as much as the feudal ones in the Middle Ages. It all stems from that. In the Italic armies of the Archaic period, which remained overwhelmingly infantry-based, even though cavalry was actually pretty good in the Apennine Peninsula, just like the Brits could not be exiled. This was not feudal societies across Europe except for Macedon, right? And of course the steppes. However, the centrality of the knight as a hero, as a leader, is everywhere, right? It's actually the most important narrative. Still, they mostly fought as infantry, including dismounted horsemen, as we've seen in some videos about Roman archaic cavalry, sort of the development of Roman cavalry in general. The principal weapons were the spear, the asta, and the sword. The gladius, that is also basically the standard term, but there are also earlier variants, like the gladius we intend mostly what we start calling the gladius hispaniensis, that was, as you know, a blend between the Iberian falcata and the Celtic Latine swords, but the Romans actually had pretty much the same things. There were the xithoid, there were the copis. As a matter of fact, if you look at Lanuvium, the Lanuvian warrior, you have this massive 80 centimeters long copis, right? They chopped heads and limbs off like crazy, right? So the difference between a straight versus a curved sword is practically null in terms of basic expandability, right? The copis, in that case, in the Lanuvian panoply, is associated with mounted combat that, as Xenophon explains later, like it's better suited for, in fact, like mounted fighting as a curved blade. But in general, like what matters is having the training, and that was a very elite one. The Lanuvian warriors from the 5th century BC, like we know, these guys made stunts on horseback all the time. There was a pure athleticism. It was that phase of that, also the Orientalizing period, and these were knights, right? They were the single most ultra hyper elite you can imagine, and they could use all other kind of weapons, supplemented by javelins, axes, and daggers, right? The shields were the scutum for the large Italic type that would eventually stick to as a majority one down the line. You have the helmets, galea, the breastplates, lorica, and graves, ocrii, offering varying degrees of protection. And these terms are mostly generic. There were different types, but that's also what they functionally fulfilled as basic equipment. Again, if you look at European, sedentary, and Mediterranean arms and armor, we're talking the same kind of warrior, essentially, as a model. While the 9th century funerary assemblages still appear relatively uniform, indicating fairly egalitarian societies, from the 8th century onward, clear signs of social differentiations emerge, with richer weapons and armor along with the first imported objects from Greece, southern Italy, Phoenicia, and Central Europe. That's the moment in which these peoples that have reinjected themselves in the Italian peninsula from the north start building a proper hierarchy through more sort of organized militaries. This gradual stratification reflected the development of Italic communities towards more complex forms of warfare, in which the possession of superior quality weapons became a marker of status and power. Right, the Lanuvian panoply is perhaps the best example of that, also as one of a horseman. Clan leaders, in particular, displayed far more elaborate equipment than ordinary warriors, and this certification was important. Hoplite shields, the clippos/aspis, the most visible expression of this new style of warfare, do not seem to have happened in Italy before the mid-7th century BC, and this chronology is supported by finds from Fabriano in the Marche region with early hoplite-influenced burials and by the available corpus of vase paintings. The adoption of Hellenic-style armament is firmer confirmed, as we were saying before, by the stele of Aule Felusca discovered at Vetulonia and dating to the second half of the 7th century. However, there is no reliable archaeological iconographic or contemporary evidence that early Romans in particular, or even the Etruscans in any sustained way fought, again, in a true hoplite phalanx formation. This is completely off the table. Claims to the contrary found in later authors such as Livy or the Ineditum Vaticanum are considered unreliable, as these sources often projected later ideals or misunderstood archaic terminology. We can't make that philological work, but we'll get to that in a particular video. The shield, the scutum, represented the most widespread defensive element. The large italic scutum, typically made of wood and leather and often featuring a central boss umbo with a horizontal grip, provided effective protection against blows and projectiles. Many examples were constructed from perishable materials, wood, leather, bone, that are far less visible in the archaeological record today, but that were presumably, in fact, more numerous than we think. Again, if you are rich, you will have tendentially hoplitic equipment that is also better preserved. Were it only for the beautiful Etruscan funerary painting, because, as you know, those tombs were looted quite a few times throughout history. The Romans, the Latins at large, and so also the rest of the Italics, are more primitive, are more brutal. They're less into sort of artistry, this kind of sophistications. And while we find, again, excellent panoplies like the one of Lanuvian, we would like to mention here, we also have less iconographic evidence from the wall, right? Finds such as the warrior of Capestrano, this famous 6th century BC limestone statue from Abruzzo. So this was at the time Pisane or Vestine territory near modern Capestrano, standing over 2 meters tall, including its base, depicting a standing warrior with circular bronze breastplates and backplates, lorica or cardiophylax discs, mounted on an iron support and joined by straps, bracelets on the left arm, similar to those mentioned in Sabine legions, sandals, a wide-brimmed helmet, axe, by the way, decorated sword with knife and supported by spear-carved pillars, illustrate this equipment in remarkable native Italic style with traces of original paint, even possibly representing a local leader like Naevius Pumpuledius. We'll talk about the Picenes and the Picentes, if you prefer, and their neighbors, by the way. The warrior is provided with this red ochre pigment, right, supported by spear-engraved pillars. It portrays this Piscine chieftain in full regalia, including a distinctive broad-brimmed helmet. It's also a bit it's not meant to be fully naturalistic. Like the helmet is the most striking thing if you look at him, but obviously you have to look at the details and try to make an effort of properly understanding what they were trying to represent there. You had that disc armor that you find also across the Mediterranean, like it's the cardiophylax. It could be, I don't know, circular, rectangular, whatever, all right, but always fulfilling that function of protecting the chest, the heart, and in this sense, offering unparalleled insight into 6th century Central Italic elite warrior display that blended functional protection with symbolic status in funerary contexts, because these were the double, right, and the doctrine of the two natures, right, sort of the guardian angel and sort of the actualization of the warrior itself. Now, the typical Italic shield, sometimes oval or rounded, rectangular in shape, was built from wooden planks arranged in cross layers reinforced by a central wooden spine and usually covered with felt or leather. I would like to stress that the scutum, as we understand it, we know it from also later Roman history, is a native Italic thing. Like, even though the Celts and other peoples have similar shields, there is no mutuation from one another, right? They also have relatively different characteristics, and that's true also for the Tureoi that were imported by both Celtic invaders and Italic mercenaries in the 70s, the 80s of the 3rd century BC in Hellas, right? And just for telling you how how many ways can there be to make a shield, right? This is typical. There are differences, but at the end of the day, whether you had to use this or the hoplite, like the point is sort of scarcely different from one another, yet still functional in different ways. And the scutum weighs 8 kilos, by the way, so it's not really this particularly lighter thing. His construction offered good resistance to impacts while preserving sufficient maneuverability. It was sturdy, rugged, the spears broke against it, so it was actually a massive thing. And the warrior's left hand, protected by the boss, gripped a transversal handle, allowing him to advance compactly within the formation when needed, yet the equipment as a whole favored versatility for both formation fighting and individual action. In fact, the fact that it's convex, and more convex, in fact, than the hoplite in that sense, speaks volumes, because it shows you how more lateral protection the warrior needed, and that was obviously because he was more exposed in either a looser, or at least formation, or more individual fighting, which technically the hoplite was optimized for not properly being. And this is because, indeed, classical Hellenic phalanxes were kind of thicker in order compared to these Italic formations. Now, in contrast to the more circular, in fact, in heavier Hellenic hoplite shields, that in Latin were called the clipos, as we know, Italic versions emphasize greater versatility, suiting them for both pitched battles and the more fluid engagements typical of wars among Apennine populations. And they existed all across. You don't really have to wait for the Samnitic Wars for this to happen. By the way, we don't even know with certainty or whether this equipment was adopted in parallel, for example, with certain specific types of pilum. The pila already existed. Everybody had javelins and heavy javelins, and where things would to refine down the line. But again, don't think that the Samnite Wars is what basically make the Roman legionnaire just that guy at the same, so that decided to equip himself with that specific combination of arms and armor for the Samnites. Like this is a much more smoothly fluid development of what already existed fundamentally in Italic warfare, even during the so-called hoplitic orientalizing phase. All right. According to the most recent reconstructions, the complete panoply, so the panoplia di arma of, to speak it the Latin way, of a hoplite equipped warrior in Italy could weigh as much as 35 kilograms. It included the helmet, the cuirass, the large circular shield, the spear, and greaves. Although regarded as less essential, the equipment also, this was the elite, right, comprises sword, and perhaps this is actually an understatement. The sword, as we've seen before, very often was actually massive, right? And especially since people were tendentially less armored, it was even more needed to chop, right? You have supplementary armor elements such as goggles or other limb protections. This substantial weight demanded continuous training and excellent physical condition. That's why it was for an elite, like qualities that actually citizen soldiers of the Hellenic polis and later of Italic centers had to maintain, right? The idea is that the classical Hellenic hoplite was more, usually, in fact, Hellenic armies were really about heavy infantry as well. Debunking the hoplitic heresy to claim that was just such intense combined armed tactics is wrong. Like, there are exceptions to a monolithic stereotypical hoplitic battle that I couldn't even myself sort of simply say that's one. It does not exist. But still, yes, like the point of hoplitic equipment in Hellas was a it's counterintuitive, because you would think the heavier the equipment, the stronger the warrior. Well, but the heavier the equipment for better protection in a thickly packed formation in battles that normally are fought in relatively chivalric terms, where two sides gave each other an appointment, to say, to fight in a given time and place. And it's useless to criticize Herodotus for putting that concept around. It is actually correct, right? This thing of the hoplitic heresy has so much polluted the mind, and now everything that goes toward that direction must be wrong. No, it's definitionally that. What you have to reduce from the hoplitic heresy is, aside from the chronology and the rigidity of the scheme, the fact that it was slightly less than that, right, in meaningful art of war terms. But it's not like the Greeks did not fight like that, right? And so these were normally short engagements against a symmetrical enemy. The system that, one side broke, it was done, right? So remember that the Hellenic citizen is a farmer citizen of some sort, something in between that. Fundamentally, it's not a professional trooper. Not even the Spartans received this particularly intense training compared to, an Apenninic warrior was to go through, just because of the conditions of his own society throughout all his life, right? Those were the better of the Greeks. They were very disciplined and orderly because they performed as Spartans those maneuvers faster and better than the others, and that's why they were so fierce. But if we're talking about individual training and lifestyle, it's obvious that Italic warriors were much more into sustained warfare. The point is that in part, but they were also more primitive and less affluent, and so they fought in part also with lighter equipment. But the elite, oh boy, right? And that's why there is actually much more cavalry in Italic warfare than there is in Hellenic one, even though it's not like the latter didn't have, or in meaningful terms. But if you look at the average contingents, like especially the Italics fielded to the Romans that had already started to gentrify a little bit after the conquest of Italy, you realize a very big, robust contingent. The Romans had actually pretty darn good cavalry, and they had even better commanders than the Numidians, all right, as far as equestrian combat is concerned. That people was quite advanced. So there are lots of preconceptions, blatant mistakes regarding the quality of these forces, and people tend to mix dynamics from different times of Roman history, not to understand what that society was fundamentally about and how much of a warband-based, feudally minded, mobster-minded, individualistic warrior ethos loaded one was probably the archaic Roman one. This, by the way, was particularly important in an era when most combatants came from the agricultural population and needed to balance the demands of war with the needs of work in the land. So an Hellenic hoplite would mostly load itself in armor because this war needed to be short, right? And he had to also come back to his fields. An Italic warrior was plundering somebody else's field normally, right? And in war banding activities, you can see it in the famous Sodales Mamertei, in the Mamertines as well. They were, in that sense, practically the same thing. Archaic Roman Italic warfare is a war-band-based society, and this is what essentially the Hellenists do not quite have in the same way anymore. Like their districts, their circumscriptions are, of course, based on the older tribes, but they have sort of moved much more away from that than their Western neighbors, so to say. Roman training appears to have been particularly demanding and comprehensive as well. There were much more varied weapons. The spear, a humble yet extremely common weapon due to its simplicity and low cost, was typically 2 to 3 meters long, featuring an ashwood shaft and a metal head, often leaf-shaped or angular with a central rib. From that, you can understand many ways about how they were properly used, right? These were designed to pierce effectively without becoming stuck as well. And there were all kinds, telling the truth. It's obvious that the heavier elements of the army were equipped for fighting against their own correspective in the enemy ranks. And so they had tendentially more traumatic anti-armor weapon like axes, right? This spear was employed as a thrusting weapon in close combat while the grip kept firmly in hand. Ashwood was preferred for its ability to absorb shocks without splintering, making the spear versatile in both war and hunting. The head, initially of bronze and later increasingly of wrought iron head shapes, optimized for maximum penetration and rapid recovery of the shaft. Over time, the Romans gradually replaced the light-throwing asta with the pilum, because they had partly this lighter forms. In fact, when you look at spears and javelins, like the question is, where do you draw the line? We can always throw that, right? So there were obviously javelins were more sort of specialized for spears were more specialized for throwing, so to say. That's lax is proper. Whereas, others were much bulkier and understood as some sort of stopping power. Unlike the javelin, early forms such as the verutum or pilum, which was intended for throwing, the spear in its traditional thrusting role remained in the warrior's grasp and could serve as the central element of collective pressure when required. The pilum itself existed in several variants, as we know, lighter ones of 1.0 to 2 meters long, weighing 1.3 to 1.8 kilos, thrown from 30 to 35 meters, and heavier versions around 2.10 meters. Yes, with a long iron shank weighing about 2 kilos. And you find this actually among other populations as well. It's not really unique to the Romans, to the Italic peoples, but it's also fair to say, and I made an entire video explaining the development of the protopilum, as a matter of fact. There was an intense, right, this very intense kind of warfare, as we well know from the military history of Roman conquest of Italy. So this was a hell of a fighting and schooling ground at the same time. We know how the pilum, and there are lots of experiments, especially with the later types, where how it's highly effective at penetrating shields. Experiments confirm it could pierce 2 to 3 centimeters of wood. But I also, frankly, don't think this experimental archaeology is that relevant all in all. Listen to the sources first, which is never enough, right? And of course, it was highly effective at piercing people. Right? It could also disable enemy shields as a secondary effect by bending on impact. And this is also by some degree, again, whichever the purpose was, especially if you look at later Roman warfare, or if we're not talking about these ones that are even vaguer, like you can have all the debates you want. The notion that the pilum would have been of also here external influence is fundamentally false. There is no proof of this whatsoever. All other peoples around used this to begin with, so why wouldn't the Italics use it? The Gauls, the Etruscans, the Iberians, the Samnites, also among the Oscans specifically. You have early finds in Etruscan sites like Vulci and Talamone, and associations with southern Italic Saunian javelins as well. So these were fairly universal weapons to begin with. We've seen it before with the Copis. It was pretty much out there, that there were all these different, sometimes regional variations. We remember the falcata for the berry, but these were all swords that had stemmed at some point from the Lambat, right? Same also famed battle axe of 3000, 4000 BC. It had parallels in Mesopotamian Neolithic culture. So again, this is completely normal all across Europe. The Romans, however, refined and integrated the pilum systematically, especially during the 4th century BC with adaptations, but this thing already existing before and just becoming better at specific tactical tasks during the centuries. The pilum's design with its long iron shank that bent on impact to render shields useless, while the weight had ensured deep penetration, represented a key Roman weapon refined through iterative campaigns, allowing legionnaires to disrupt enemy formations before closing with the gladius. And the interesting part, again, is that in this Italic myth grinder, this happened from both sides, and at large, heavy javelins or javelins in general were always exchanged across people. So even in this, consider how functionalized the Romans had become by, say, the early empire with these weapons, but also how, in this sense, say, how truly unique in that sense they are, but on the basis of a pretty strong structure that had otherwise remained undistinguished on the basis of these javelins, right? So that's how you can feel like the power of the Roman legions emerging from an otherwise intentionally homogeneous background. The transition from bronze to iron, at least in part, marked a significant development. Although bronze allowed more precise casting, and it would in fact kept being used throughout all antiquity, telling the truth. Iron, being more abundant and easier to shape through forging, enabled cheaper and more widespread production. And so the point is that when the Romans start equipping larger amounts of troops and they're steadily supplied, etc., of course, iron becomes more sort of viable, right? And a way for the rank and file soldier to access quality weapons. The notion that the Romans were simply contributing to providing with their own equipment out to Marius, as you know, is false. Basically, since the siege of Veii, we're told that the state essentially compensated at least the soldiers in part for the expenses. And since the system was actually evolving from a feudal organization, you actually know that the patrician gentes were already basically, as also the state was developing in their hand, providing for that kind of equipment, right, through subcontracting some of their private resources, as it was a great political competition in all of this as well. The sword, by contrast, evolved from the sort of shorter models it's of the previous eras. It symbolized status and authority. In this period, two main types were distinguished: the short, broad blades intended primarily for cutting, and longer, more tapered blades, such as the antenna type of Central European origin, measuring about 70 centimeters. But again, they increase, right? And they were modeled on the warrior, normally suitable for both cutting and thrusting. And there's always an approximation. Obviously, most swords were just doing both. And these swords usually had organic or metal grips and a pronounced guard. They became the preferred weapon for hand-to-hand combat once the line of spears was broken. Their manufacture required considerable skill. A well-balanced center of gravity and a solid junction between blade and tang were essential to withstand violent cutting blows. In elite burials, such as those at Alfedena that we've seen also for our recent Samnitic history video, Campo Vallano in Abruzzo, and related Italic necropolis with rich iron swords inlaid with ivory and decorated scabbards, such swords frequently appear with rich decoration, underscoring their practical, symbolical, and ceremonial importance, and not just among the aristocracy. The armament of the Roman army in this period was thus relatively heterogeneous. The democratic character of warfare required each combatant to provide a basic panoply, while still allowing wide scope for personal customizations and individual preferences. Equipment came from sophisticated Etruscan workshops, from weapons and gear typical of the Apennine peoples of Italy, and in considerable part from spoils and war booty. This variety reflected the composition of the early Roman army itself, formed by citizens, or what they were becoming, to be recognized as such, of different social extraction and allies from various tribal backgrounds. The poorest members often relied on minimal leather protections and recovered weapons. We know this very well through the segmented sort of classes of recruitment that we're told, in fact, different stages of being issued sort of something different according to the changes that had come about in the army and society. Many protective elements, such as helmets, rectangular or circular breastplates, and the Lorica also recovered from Esquiline tombs, for example, in Greaves, could be made of bronze. However, it is likely that the majority of warriors used, in fact, lighter and cheaper versions in organic materials. And regarding organic materials, there is always a sort of widespread debate because obviously it's not much that we don't have them as they perished away, but because we don't clearly understand, like we don't have even some particularly direct evidence of that and or how it could play in the world. But of course, there was some kind of padded armor, there were all kinds of adaptations. And this obviously had a tactical relevance as well. Only with the Servian system that actually ends up overlapping with what was likely the chameleon one, because as you know, this is the mythological constitutional reform attributed to King Servius Tullius, and so traditionally this would have happened between 578 and 535, right? And we have and made an entire video about this topic, and there we explain essentially what it was meant to be, right? This was essentially dividing Roman citizens into wealth-based classes, the census for military and political purposes, with the first class over 100,000 asses providing full hoplite-like equipment, so a helmet, round shield, greaves, cuirass, spear, sword, in 80 centuries of juniores and seniores, descending to lighter gear in lower classes, including the use of oblong shields in some, which introduced greater internal differentiation by census, already moving away from universal hoplite model, which paradoxically is what instead the Servian reform was in theory to chronologically overlap with, right? So, this did more standardized equipment begin to appear. So this is the actual revelation that there wasn't such a thing like a hoplitic army, even though, again, the top class would look as heavy, but again, with the rest of the army not playing along what was normally already the organization in classical Hellas. But at the same time, the later sources that describe this social segmentation, speaking of the 6th century BC, are essentially projecting some civil and legal, administrative, and economic attributions to that society that did not really work like that. There was nobody to establish an actual census in such a uniform, standardized way, especially considering that warfare itself would do that, right? War bands, like how do we imagine this having happened, I don't know, in pre-literate societies, right? Like in other times of the history. Like we just see the segmentation, it was obvious, it was based on what people had. And surely, like, there was an important form of organization. These were not really poor places at all, but they were still very primitive. They were still very clinically based. And so everything was run in an oligarchic private fashion, and there isn't like somebody who issues this for a whole citizenry. That did not even exist as such, right? So it is true that this is the age in which the Etruscan political model is sort of affirming itself, but also that one was pretty blurred compared to an idea of a proper city-state, right? In a way that in absolute terms was not even there in Hellas, let alone in Italy, right? So as you've seen in that video about Servius Tullius, actually the census reforms definitely do indicate that more standardized equipment begin to appear. In spite of the fact that the Romans never fully embraced a rigid hoplite phalanx. But they also probably speak of at least in terms of administrative and institutional framework, of a reality that was more akin to the chameleon reforms, right? If you think about the Servian walls, right, that we know archaeologically were actually built exactly more or less around the chameleon era. So everything overlaps. And basically what the later Roman tradition is telling us is that at least they were projecting something a bit more back in time to date the foundation of a proper political system before, at least with a political system with these characteristics, whereas their step up toward a statal system happened only throughout the 4th century BC. And for all reasons, including their expansion, the methods still is increasing militarization and expansion, right, of Rome at the expense of other peoples, and with the final conquest of the peninsula, the affirmation of the Romano-Italic Confederacy that will eventually create the empire. So this is the point. Servius Tullius' census reforms were meant in this tradition, later historiographical tradition, to parallel Solon's democratic changes in Athens. Right? This is from a moment in which the Romans cared about comparing themselves with the Greeks, because they were at that point much more directly involved in their politics, and they had come to actually dominate them, to crush them in battle, but they had to show them that they were kind of sort of comparable in cultures, and they tended to, in this sense, also alter a bit the lines of a history that we reconstructed only from a few decades, essentially, in its concreteness, right? And in fact, did not witness any meaningful Servian reform, if not, at least in much more primitive ways, aligned, in fact, with the 6th century BC. And so this organization in, for example, of the Roman society into 5 or 6 wealth classes, assessed and assigned military equipment obligations according and creating the centurate assembly for both political voting and army organization, thereby broadening participation while tying service to property. This did not exist in Roman society until the 4th century BC in any meaningful way. Surely the urbanizing and probably urban Rome of the Etruscan era, so to say, had something similar to this, but it was not so straightforward and advanced and categorical. Right? The feudal clans dominated, and the plebeians were mostly retinue men. The Etruscans obviously tried to establish something more dirigistic, autocratic, but it fails because eventually they are expelled and sort of beaten badly, even though there wasn't even a real Etruscan domination of Rome. It was more like the same Roman patricians that called some rulers super partes that could put an end to their feuds to some degree. It's very interesting dynamics that happen also in communal Italy during the Middle Ages. And so you have to read the Roman sagas also through sort of specific sort of meaning of their archetype, rather than thinking of that as chronological history, obviously enough, which, again, before the early 3rd century BC, we can't properly do for Rome. I mean, it's actually real, but it's more like what the Romans put together in later times from actual historical material they had, and that is unfortunately lost about their own city, but that and that in part does align with the picture, but that must be compounded with proper criticism and a series of other sources intersection. Consider that at the beginning of this video's chronology, there were still war chariots around, right? So those were telling you what kind of mentality the Romans had up to fairly late in time, right? And compare especially with the Greeks, and therefore also the development of the hoplitic model as the development of a political model. And even later, the Romans will have a different military system anyway. And so, as we've seen here, it's obvious that would already be in tribal Rome a equipment segmentation. Wealthier classes could afford bronze cuirasses. From the 6th, 5th century onward, the more comfortable, breathable linothorax in some cases, also known as loricalinthea, made of multiple layers of linen glued with resin and equipped with pteruges to protect the lower abdomen. This armor offered solid protection against blows while remaining lighter, providing an excellent balance of protection, flexibility, and breathability under the Mediterranean sun, right? I mean, fighting in armor is exhausting, even in Northern Europe, under the sun. You can imagine during the season, right? And that's also why, by the way, the weather allowed for the campaign to start in March, that is called like this because of the Romans, in fact. Whereas, I don't know, think about the field of Mars that was in May in Carolingian times, just in northern France. So this meant also a lot of sort of a longer warfare season that, as you know, in the Roman calendar was also specifically and sort of provided with symbolism we discussed here and there in our videos about Roman religion tied to this continuous war at this point, rather than the more drilled legionary forces of the later era. This was much more kind of feudal private warfare, right? And so again, you have these other types of armor that proved more practical than the stiffer and hotter bronze cuirass during long campaigns. Nevertheless, of course, the elite fought with that anyway. The myth that you would risk being killed as opposed to suffer heat. It does happen. Also in the Middle Ages, it happened that some warriors stripped themselves of their armor because of terrible environmental discomfort. But normally, Like these men were habituated to suffer the pains of hell on a regular basis. So the temperature was important, but not even at the top of their concerns. Besides, they knew how to suffer, for sure. Especially considering the unspeakable training, initiatic introduction to the sacred brotherhood of warriors, like in the Italic spring, so-called Italic spring, the Vers Sacrum. Now, this development in general represented an important step toward recruiting a larger number of troops into the army, broadening the social base of Rome's defense. Because in theory, like this mostly, again, happens during the Camillian era, you have each class that now is considered as a Roman citizen, and so has the duty and privilege to participate to the army. And the lesser people had pushed for that. The plebs wanted that. So against also any pacifistic idiocy, of course, actually the greatest achievement of Roman civilization was exactly redeeming, right, through manumission and the baptism of fire, so to say, these mass of dispossessed plebeians that would go on to be, in fact, the masters of the world, as the legionaries from mostly a proletarian background will become, like conquering other peoples and becoming noblemen in comparison to the other plebeians. Right? So this is incredibly important. You have, again, all type of varieties here. We could talk about helmets, which range from conical or crested models to more complex forms with cheek pieces and greaves, completing the panoply. You have smaller items such as armbands or additional greaves were being generally reserved for wealthier soldiers or veterans. Segmentation was very important in that eventual increase in battle depth, so much so that you've known that triadi being, those would have been the actual astati, even though the terminology remained more like in the first rank, because this is also how it happened initially. If you wonder why that happened, it's because the guys from the first ranks had to be the tougher ones, had to be the ones with the bulkier spears, right? And so initially, those were the astati, right? But since they remained in the front, like they eventually maintained the name, but the heavies were actually shifted in the rear. So it's the battle line that gives, at that point, that maintains the name of the weapon. This is very interesting also from an anthropological point of view, because it's not a mistake. It's like knowing those are the guys who, because you see, the spear has a value, an incredibly divine value. That's actually before the sword, even a symbol of manhood. Think about Gungnir for Odin. And the true man initially is a spearman, more than a swordman per se, right? And so again, we're talking incredibly primitive and archaic mentalities behind this. Coping with the stepping up of something else. The Romans are very traditional, very courageous also in that gradual change. So they were good at adapting and coping with this new challenges, but at the same time they cared about their prior practice and habit. Archaeology mainly recovers the metal components, as we know, but it's reasonable to assume that the bulk of combatants supplemented these with, in fact, thick leather protections or fabric padding, creating hybrid solutions that combined resources and functionality. Consequently, any analysis of the Roman army's armament in this era necessarily overlaps with a study of the characteristic equipment of the various peoples who were also Rome's allies. And here we're talking mostly just the same Italics or Italians, in fact, or foes that were at a time, especially the earliest time, the same peoples. And so sort of breaking the spell of the Romans had such a unique type of army. They were Italics like all the others, so we don't see any meaningful difference, right? Sure is that Latium was the place, the most advanced place, though, already, right from the beginning, aside from the Etruscans, that, however, had also very different society as well. So more or less, we can say that the Latins did pioneer this kind of top-notch italic warfare, even though, again, they were very similar to the other italics, to the Oscans. And so this spirit is crucial. I made already a video about that. They had to routinely fight against, I don't know, the Gauls, but those also fought in relatively similar ways. We've seen this in the video about the Allia River, as a matter of fact, because there are very interesting insights from also later accounts that, however, speak of a tradition that evidently the Romans were carrying from those moments, because this had been such pivotal moments in their own sagas, in their own military history, right? They remember what they had done. They remember the debates regarding how they had to go with the army, and especially with society, politically wise, in order to step up in a truly divine sense. Archaeology and research into the cultures of central Italy, such as the Picanes, known for elaborate bronze work and seafaring in the Adriatic, the Vestini, the Samnites, mountain confederations, famous for their flexible infantry and distinctive oval shields, among others, being, again, also in this sense, pretty much the same like any other Italic, and others in the Apennine and Adriatic zones have supplied valuable finds and evidence, enabling us to reconstruct not only the external appearance of the archaic Roman warrior, but also the development of a society that gradually transformed its peasants into citizen soldiers. And I say peasants here as plebeians, because again, the feudal class historically had been already even probably with a lot of cavalry. If you read, this is very interesting about Roman warfare. If you read about their sagas of the early era, if you think about Romulus's Celeres, or any other, like so many other battles. I made a video actually long time ago about archaic Roman cavalry, and I added to it with other episodes. But let's say there is cavalry everywhere. Were they even just to dismount? But those are noblemen. That Rome is founded by knights. This is what these people were carrying from their steppe ancestry. They were incredibly self-aware about it, and they distinguished themselves, in fact, as conquerors, even fairly recent ones, from the Pelasgianly dominating world here, that was in fact more like the divide between patricians and plebeians did follow like along the pattern of some, at least to an extent, of racial differentiation. This is incredibly important, all right? And so this is what we know about the Romans in many ways: learning, adapting, innovating. And these early tactics are very interesting. You have this tribal roots stepping up into the manipular system, actually without an intermediate hoplitic phase. This is the actual point that I make, that even if the hoplitic army of a Servian reform that was supposed to have happened, again, those sort of earlier centuries, had ever brought hoplitic arms and armor, still this was just a facade thing. From the most affluent elements that were still maintaining this more heroic vibe from before. Before they would have had war chariots. So it does make sense, but it diluted more in a more widely militarized society compared to the Greeks. And so even though there is that kind of orientalizing and hoplitic phase in Etruscan Roman warfare, and partially surely in the rest also of Italian warfare, we see this among the Veneti, so other populations, through iconography. There wasn't like the creation of an hoplitic army in between, like the heroic and the manipular one, right? It was like a smooth development where it's probably the social composition that changes, and therefore arms and armor change, as opposed to actually changing from some radical sort of imported tactical system that nobody had any reason to basically install. For what, right? It all worked more or less like that, with heavier guys in the front and the others following. Like it's as simple. It's just like a fashion. You can't argue that it's basically it. And so this is the actual gradual development that lays the foundations for Rome's future military greatness. And this was supposed to be about arms and armor, but it's obvious that we have to mix it with all these other aspects, otherwise it wouldn't make any sense. It would be just a list of material pieces and nobody would actually care about it. I hope that these videos really help, because they are properly designed to make you understand how much Rome steps up from a incredibly primitive tribal background in an incredibly short amount of time into what we see as the manipulator system. That's in fact not born even as properly a fully developed military system. It's a fully matured military system like the one we see in the Second Punic War. It's already at that point, like many people think, oh my God, it's all about flexibility and agility, and they could, outflank the enemy. No, right? That was still the idea of the phalanx, but more in depth. And there weren't sort of willing, wanted outflanking maneuvers with agile maniples. They didn't have the collective training at the beginning to do that, right? It's an incredibly long period and process that mostly builds up throughout centuries of de facto continuous warfare, which we have also seen in the series we made about the introduction to the development of the Roman, to the introduction to the Roman conquest of Italy. And we have to talk, in fact, much more about the actual campaigns, right? I would like to do this, if possible, through simply direct primary accounts, like segmenting this we can, of course, make videos about the general introduction to the period, etc. But at some point, we will have to end up, because it's beautiful just to read the sources, simply reading the primary sources as well, right? Being very careful also about what these sources say, because sometimes they also say different things, especially if they're, from what they actually happened, but in subtle ways that mix partial truths and so on, but because they were written later. And they were trying to rationalize or trying to sort of appeal to some other concept. They're making sense themselves, right? Because this is really what is readily evident. If you read Livy, you understand he made a terrific work. He was actually a very traditional thinker, but also belonged to a more modern secular period to the ones that he's discussing. And there are points in which you realize he was evidently drawing from previous knowledge that unfortunately was lost in the form, because surely it wasn't merely oral at the time. It was written down at some point. All the various sagas of these battles, of the various heroes and commanders, the various gentes knew about them. So it would be incredible to reason of how this stuff was actually recorded and preserved to an extent. But you understand he was trying himself to make sense of the older ways, right? This is not true just for warfare. It's also a thing politically, religiously. So it's provided that, yes, it's all part of a broader frame. In fact, if you really read what he writes in the end, he actually nails that. Like the things he tells us, even maybe not in unwillingly or accidentally, but sort of indirectly and sort of implying them as well, is like a very intelligent reconstruction of the sources he had regarding this matters. That's why they actually make sense. They make a lot of sense. And so, again, I'm glad that we are at that point. We're talking more about archaic Rome, archaic Italy. Admittedly, we don't make so much about this recently because of how we mix the whole package normally. But overall, we have ever more videos on this stuff, and we will naturally come to cover this also more frequently at a point. So it's, again, incredibly important to look at. If you, for example, if you look at Archaic Rome, there was this video made last year about Rome in the Age of Kings, Wealth, Power, and Urbanization in Latium Vetus, from the 8th to the 6th century BC. This is very archaic. It's pretty darn good stuff, right? If you want to know what was happening, if you look at the details and everything. Also, other big video, why Rome and Israel never actually had any form of a political phase, army tactics in their warfare. This is quite important as well. And yeah, there is a bunch of interesting videos that we made that are very specific, including the one about Rome's early enemies, the Serbian Reform, the Battle of Suessa. Feudal Roman warfare is the best, as a matter of fact. You have also the one on archaic military mindset. And so we are not that badly placed overall. I would say that we need more of this content, and I have to find a way also to introduce perhaps not a new series, but through the specials to talk more about this and to talk more about, and this is the only topic that I'm holding back. Like when I started the channel, my idea was I can't speak about the big guns immediately, and eventually I started doing so, and I realized there was always more to say. Like in this case, we made only relatively sort of similar videos, right? So but I always thought that one of the Roman army, especially the Republican period, is incredibly, let's say, demanding. Say it's something you really have to overly prepare for, and in ways again that are difficult to explain to someone who thinks that this is just like a topic like another or something like it. So again, I think that we're doing well enough, and we can indeed continue with what I will think of. Excuse me, I'm getting slightly distracted. Very well, however, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.